Regan Slaymaker for Radiant.Green. I have the pleasure to be joined by Claire Miller, Independent Mobility and Energy Advisor and former Director of Technology and Innovation for Octopus EVs. Claire, how are you today?
Hey, good. Thanks, Reagan. Thanks for having me.
No problem. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to interview you today. We'll jump straight into it. So great that you're speaking at Solar and Storage Live in Birmingham this year, moderating two sessions. The first one that kind of I do want to touch on is kind of the first panel is what does the future hold for vehicle to grid technology? I mean, how important in your view is the development of V2G and advancing energy security?
Thanks. Yeah, really important. I think in its own right, but also in the context of the whole grid is becoming much more digitized, and we have a much higher amount of renewable energy on the grid. And so, not just in this country, but in all countries around the world, we're starting to see more and more renewable energy generation. So we see like solar, we see lots of wind, and other sort of novel generation technologies are coming. And the thing about those, which makes them different to burning coal or burning gas, is that you only generate when that natural resource is available. And so that means that the availability of that is quite intermittent. And that means you need to store energy at times when the wind isn't blowing and when the sun isn't shining, so that you can then use it later on to keep that grid balanced. So balancing supply and demand becomes like even more important than it is today. And so when you think about all the vehicles that are out there today that are going to become electric, yes, passenger vehicles, so millions of passenger vehicles will become electric over the coming sort of 5, 10, 20 years, but also every other vehicle that does a job. So operational vehicles, vans, heavier trucks, also like fleets that do jobs for us that we maybe don't think about, like bin lorries, like street sweepers, buses, like all of these vehicles are going to be electrifying. And so they've got these big batteries, and they are parked up a lot of the time, particularly for passenger vehicles. And these operational vehicles, not all of them, because some of these vehicles do a job almost 24/7, and that's a different challenge to keep them charged. But in terms of the storage, lots of these vehicles will have times when they are parked up. So I guess it's thinking about, it's a massive system that interconnects, and we need to keep these vehicles working as vehicles, but they've got big batteries, and we should be thinking about how we can use those batteries to help also get more renewables on the grid. So yeah, it's a win-win. If we can get the technology right, we can get the experience right, and we can make sure that customers, be those individuals, people listen to this in their homes, or businesses, actually get the benefit as well of taking part in this.
Definitely. Obviously, you mentioned kind of obviously these especially the larger vehicles. Obviously, they've got big batteries. Obviously, the technology is quite kind of, I don't want to say it's got further to go than kind of say passenger vehicles as well. But one thing that you kind of what you wanted to make clear when we were preparing for this interview is kind of it's not kind of thinking about kind of how to implement the technology, is getting the technology out there and using it sooner rather than later. How important is kind of that mindset when kind of electrifying such larger heavy duty vehicles as well?
I think it's a really good point. I think we are in a bit of an unfortunate point in the transition to decarbonising different forms of transport and different like operational vehicles, where there is an element of debate about sort of the next level of technology, or the next sort of generation of different propulsion technologies. And whilst that is being debated, it can sometimes like suck the oxygen out of the room for actually discussing how we have batteries, and we have battery technology that works brilliantly. And so there is an element of, I think, I wouldn't say delay, but kind of slow decision making for folks who are looking at larger buses and lorries and operational vehicles, thinking, well, maybe hydrogen as a fuel will be an option, or maybe hydrogen fuel cells, or maybe biofuels is what we should be looking at, or maybe there's some other technology out there. And so when you have that sort of debate going on, where an element of doubt, and you think about that from an investment perspective, it's easy to understand how investors are waiting to see which technologies win out. And in the UK at the moment, at least, the government is not backing one or other technology. They're remaining kind of resolutely neutral, but we have batteries that work for these applications right now. And so I think it's kind of taking a step back and saying, yeah, great, let's have a space for debate, and let's have a space for tech innovation. And if those technologies come to market, then great, let's see how they perform in the market, against other products. meanwhile, you have manufacturers, I mean, particularly like in the HGV space, I'm thinking of like Volvo. Volvo have got over 100 eHGVs on the road now in the UK alone. There's DAF, Scania. There's lots of those who are kind of bringing battery powered large vehicles to market right now. And so actually, whilst the debate rages about, but maybe hydrogen could be the answer, those manufacturers are kind of working with customers, operators to say, here's the vehicle. Now let's think about the next challenge, which is around infrastructure and charging and energy. So yeah, it's an interesting one. And I think, LinkedIn sometimes can become a little bit like, the comments section on some of our sort of more red top papers, where you have people kind of spending a lot of time and energy arguing the toss over hydrogen versus batteries. Meanwhile, say you've got folks out there just getting on with it. And that's ultimately the most important thing, because, we need to move on from a kind of an innovation kind of way of thinking and piloting and trialing. We need to get these things on the road. We need to get working, because, we don't want to wait for these technologies anymore. We need to get them out there. We need to decarbonize larger trucks and heavy stuff in particular.
Definitely, and kind of I love that. Love the bit what you just said about LinkedIn there. I really hope it doesn't turn into kind of a Twitter or Facebook kind of comment spread. But either way, it's quite interesting. But also what you're saying there, kind of with innovation life cycles moving as quickly as they do, implementing the change now is surely better than kind of waiting longer and debating it as well. I do want to kind of move on to the second panel that you're talking on at Solar and Storage Live. How do we guarantee that kind of energy supply and EV ambition match up? Obviously, it kind of does lead on from the first panel in relation to V2G, but kind of, and I imagine we'll probably get sort of the same technological answers, but kind of what solutions are in place to ensure that energy supply matches up with mass uptake of EV? And I imagine vehicle to grid and smart chargers will be a huge part of this as well.
Yeah, I think it's a question which is going to be asked for many years to come as we start to, get to different parts of society. So, at the moment, there are many people out there who, yes, they're aware of electric vehicles, but they don't think it sort of relates to them and their business and how it works. And as we start to speak to more businesses, more fleet operators in particular, they start to think, well, hang on, if we put all our vehicles onto electric, how can the grid cope with that extra demand? And I guess the important thing for everyone to keep in mind is this is a transition. It's not a cliff edge. We aren't going to wake up one day and suddenly, overnight, magically, every vehicle has become electric. Because if that happens, yeah, for sure, we don't have a grid that is designed to do that today, because we don't have those vehicles today. So I think it's, again, I'm often about like kind of just take a breath, take a step back, have a think about how those planning cycles are already in place and how many different parts of our sort of ecosystem around energy and transport are starting to talk and work together. So the example I would give, and if anyone's into doing a bit of reading around the topic, I point them towards things like the National Grid Future Energy Scenarios at work. Every year, National Grid puts together a scenario around various elements of our grid and thinking about different ways in which demand could change. And so there's usually sort of 3 or 4 scenarios thinking about what they'd have to build in terms of sort of generation, transmission, so generation making that energy, transmission moving it around the country, and then for our DNOs, for those sort of distribution, like the lower voltage bit of the grid, the local bit, which is sort of to the substations and along the streets and all the way to houses and buildings, thinking about what might the world need to look like in terms of amount of energy and about moving that energy around in different scenarios. So definitely have a look at that. And then in terms of those other technologies which help, yeah, like doing more with what we've got now is also really important. So we're moving, I mentioned before, we're moving from a grid that we used to burn a lot of stuff to make our energy. And we used to do that in a really like hub and spoke way. So what that means is the hub would be the power station, so burning coal or burning gas. And the spokes are those lines, those cables coming out of there, kind of feeding different parts of the country. And then quite a high level balancing mechanism, as it's called, to turn on and off large energy using industry to try and keep it all in balance at any one time. Quite crude, quite high level. We're moving to a much more nuanced digitized grid where, in order to make the most of those cables that we've got, and also, as I mentioned before, this managing this kind of intermittent generation when you are relying on renewables, what we need is storage. So storage is so important in all of this. And so you mentioned, V2G, smart charging. it's one of the tools in our sort of green grid toolbox to make the most of the cables and the wires that we have right now, and also to only build out as much and as fast as we need to keep pace with the rollout of, you know, this electrification of transport, and actually the electrification of heat as well. So I know, you know, we're talking about vehicles, but actually we can't talk about this decarbonisation of our grid and the electrification that's going on without thinking about heat, because heat is about, you know, 1.5 times bigger than transport in terms of energy demand. So I guess, you know, in summary, when we orchestrate storage with generation, it means on a practical level, we tell our EVs when to charge to match up with when there's energy on the grid that needs to be stored somewhere, to keep that grid in balance, because you always want to have generation and demand roughly in balance. You don't want to have too much generation and nowhere for it to go, and you also obviously don't want to have lots of demand and then no energy to meet that demand. So already today, you know, any EV can be managed either directly or via a charger to actually charge at a time when there's lots of green energy on the grid that needs to go somewhere, often overnight when it's windy, because we do have an increasing amount of wind generation in the UK. And so smart charging is amazing. Smart charging is absolutely fantastic, kind of, absolutely fantastic way of helping the grid do more with the infrastructure we have right now. And then vehicle to grid is, yes, we want to time those vehicles to charge up at times when there's lots of energy. But with that technology coming, also then being able to export energy out of those vehicle batteries at times when there's not enough energy on the grid. And the crucial thing is doing it in a way which means that customers and fleet operators can still use those vehicles as vehicles, still have control, be able to set limits on how much energy can be exported, set timers on when they need the vehicle fully charged. Those are also super important elements. But yeah, we don't want to build out 2, 3, 4 times as much copper, you know, in the ground and between pylons, when we can do something a bit smarter and in pace with the rollout of these vehicles. And that's absolutely key. We need to be in lockstep with the vehicles coming onto the road, with the energy demand. And so again, I'd loop back to that, you know, future energy scenarios is an absolutely brilliant resource for anyone who's interested in what could that rollout look like, what could the timings be, and what does our national grid, what does our national grid operator think that looks like?
Definitely, and I'll put a link to the scenarios that you mentioned kind of in the description as well. I'm sure that they'll be easy to find. If not, Claire, you can send me the link and I'll chuck them in there as well.
I will.
Perfect. One, obviously, you're speaking in the Charge EV theatre. That's where a lot of these discussions are taking place at Solar and Storage Live. And obviously, one thing that kind of I think is going to be a concurrent theme is kind of unlocking mass EV uptake. Obviously, the big topical thing at the moment is the 2030 pushback that the Prime Minister's just announced. But kind of what, in your view, is the key to unlocking mass EV uptake in the UK?
Oh, it's such an interesting observation about, you know, what was announced a couple of weeks ago and what that actually means, and linking that to mass uptake. I think, you know, the thing to be really clear about is nothing has actually changed. And whilst it grabbed a lot of headlines and created a lot of sort of discussion and actually a lot of disappointment and a lot of outrage on the part of manufacturers who've been making huge investments and huge strides towards, you know, moving their manufacturing from ICE, you know, from petrol and diesel internal combustion production to battery production, and also, you know, impacting confidence in investment in the UK from the outside, you know, to say, well, actually, if this government is going to chop and change on its commitments, we don't have confidence that our investment will be as low risk as we want it to be in the UK, and they'll take their money elsewhere and go to Europe and go to America. So it had some significant impacts on that front. But actually, in terms of what it actually meant for the rollout of EVs in the UK, all that's changed is between 2030 and 2035. Right now, it won't be there won't be an opportunity just to buy hybrid vehicles, but it's actually opened up kind of a window to continue to buy petrol and diesel vehicles. Now, I would ask everyone to sort of cast their minds forward to 2030 and think about how many EVs they think will be on the road. Again, lots of projections around that, but also to think about the ZEV mandate, which was subsequently actually brought out and laid finally. We've been waiting that for a very long time, working on it really hard for a long time. Which talks about, again, from a government perspective, the percentage of vehicles that manufacturers have to sell each year that are pure battery electric. Because actually, that sets the timeline for how fast the manufacturers need to bring these vehicles to market. Now, the ZEV mandate, zero emission vehicle mandate, it talks about passenger vehicles and it talks about vans. Doesn't talk about the heavy stuff. We are not even in the drafting stage of a mandate telling manufacturers how many electric trucks they need to put on the road. So that's, I think, still a long way off. But for passenger vehicles, next year, 2024, 22% of vehicles have to be battery electric from each manufacturer. So they've set the timeline, they've set the rules, they've set the trajectory, and we can see it right there. It's going to go up year on year from 2024 to 2030. And so actually, I think your question was, what's going to hasten mass adoption or what's going to impact that? Well, unfortunately, the announcement of moving 2030 to 2030 confidence, I mentioned investors, maybe also impacted those early majority even adopters who are thinking about going electric and now maybe think maybe it's not so important. And that's, one, that's clearly wrong. It is really important. Battery electric vehicles are better in every regard than ICE vehicles. And I say that as a mechanical engineer, by the way. Like, I was trained in engines and how to build them and fix them and design them. So, they are better in every way. And then again, I go back to that kind of thought about what do we think it will look like and feel like in 2030? Are you going to be the person who, it feels a bit like the smoking ban, right? Are you that person that's still out in the rain outside having a fag when everyone else is in the pub? Are you really that person who's going out to buy a petrol car in 2030, 2031, when everybody else is now like moved to electric? I think that the impact in terms of like how to make it go faster is actually around education. And I think the piece that we're really missing, and particularly this government, I don't think we're going to see this from this government at all, sadly, is actually building confidence in EVs. So actually, no, let me take that back. The government published something called the Plan for Drivers on, well, where are we now? What's the date today? Is it the 6th or 7th of October? So like the start of this week. Yeah, so 6th of October. So the start of this week, they published something called the Plan for Drivers with very little announcement. It is the Conservative Party conference this week, so they're probably a bit busy, dancing with Nigel Farage of an evening. But they published this Plan for Drivers, which does say that they will look at how to talk about EVs in a positive way and how to work with industry to actually build confidence around EVs. So let me sort of take that back and say that is a green shoot, and I encourage that, and I welcome that plan to be turned into action on a really practical level. I think that means everything from getting in amongst schools, explaining to children what it means, the power of children persuading their parents and winning them over, and also up and down the country, thinking about how do you get out to people in their day-to-day, make it real for them, give them some confidence that there's enough charging, give them confidence in the technology. And I guess the other one is secondhand market, right? How do we support people who aren't the richest, who maybe are more vulnerable, who are, in the middle of a cost of living crisis, let's not forget. And how do we make sure that it's an equitable transition to electric vehicles for everybody? There's a lot to come in secondhand vehicles, which I think, that there are lots of levers that we can pull there, and the government can start thinking about how to help people access it. Because in Scotland, just to give people who live in England and Wales something to be jealous of, the government has had a second-hand car loan, interest-free loan, up to £30,000 to buy a second-hand EV. Now, it's a loan; it has to be paid back, but it's 0%, and we don't have that in England and Wales. So yeah, there are ways and means that could be brought to bear for second-hand as well. So yeah, so lots to be excited about, I think, as we think about this transition. And I think it will also start to go faster than we could ever imagine as we start to see the ZEV mandate kick in and that minimum percentage of vehicles start hitting the road.
There definitely are. What you've just said about the secondhand market, I'm actually planning an article right now about the secondhand EV market. So you've just helped me out a lot there, Claire. So thank you very much for that. And that's why I was writing halfway through your sentence. But there is one other topic that kind of we wanted to discuss prior to this interview, and it's not, and it's also whilst EV uptake is growing, and everyone, hopefully, like you said, is buying EVs despite the fact of the pushback. But we have to make the EV uptake accessible for everyone and ensure that no one gets left behind. Obviously, you mentioned kind of Motability in our preparation as well.
Oh, yeah.
How do we help kind of say disabled drivers or drivers who may need assistance in getting an EV? How do we help them kind of transition from ICE cars to EVs as well?
Yeah, it's such an important one because I think it's fair to say that EVs are still the preserve of the well-off. There's also an inequity around the way that folks who are employees of companies whose employers have put in place a salary sacrifice scheme can access the absolute cheapest prices on electric vehicles. So before I get onto Motability, I guess the thing I would say on that front is, at Octopus Electric Vehicles, where I was one of the founding directors there, we've worked really hard in terms of building a salary sacrifice scheme, which helps as many employees as possible get that low rate, but not every employee has access to that scheme. And so I would for sure kind of call on the government to look at how do you make that salary sacrifice scheme with the cheapest prices accessible to all employees, right? So we've seen over the last few years the introduction of a basic pensions provision for everybody. It's a requirement as an employer when you have a certain number of employees. I would like to see salary sacrifice treated in exactly the same way, because right now, unless you are lucky enough, as I say, to have an employer who brings in this scheme, then you do not have access to that. So that's probably my first point on making it as accessible as possible, as broadly as possible. And then talking about Motability, it's absolutely incredible business. It exists to help people with disabilities and those who are in receipt of the advanced personal payment mobility payments from the government actually get around to work, to live their lives, and to access those sort of experiences that the rest of us might take for granted. So Motability Operations, working in association with Motability Foundation, which used to be known as Motability, the charity. So Motability Operations operates as a lease company, and they're really starting to think about how to help folks who have different needs, different life circumstances around EVs. One of the key focuses so far, and folks may have heard about this, and Motability Foundation have looked at, is around building charging infrastructure. So, kind of, if you think about it just with a kind of common sense perspective, we're building out lots of new charge points all around the place for people to use when they're on the go and doing sort of journeys here and there. It not only does it kind of not make sense to build new infrastructure that hasn't taken accessibility into mind, but it's not fair. It's not fair, and I'm interested to see if there is yet any kind of legal challenge around, building chargers that not everybody can use and access. So I think there's a really important point there about not leaving anybody behind, especially when we're building out new infrastructure. Now, there's good news there. There's something called PAS 1899. Again, something folks can look up. It's a design standard for how to design public charging so that a wide range of users can use it. And that's thinking about accessibility, not just physical space, not just making the bays bigger, not just making the cables, sprung loaded so it's easier to hold them, because they can be incredibly heavy and hard to manage, even as an able-bodied person, but also thinking about making it, making the information clear, thinking about a range of maybe invisible disabilities and challenges that folks have. So PAS 1899, it's not the law, unfortunately. It's only a recommendation, and different charge point operators and different charge point installers and infrastructure companies have taken different approaches to adopting that, but really important one out there, I think. And I think then, their customers, they've just surpassed 700,000 vehicles on their fleet. So the biggest fleet, and they have over 34,000 EVs. So they already have arguably the biggest passenger vehicle EV fleet in the UK. Thinking about the whole experience, and actually thinking about, in the context of driving your EV, how do you charge it? How do you think about that as an energy storage asset? Back to what we were talking about, vehicle to grid. You know, in the future, if you have an EV that helps you get about and live your life, but also helps you balance the energy you use at home, that opens up all kinds of avenues which right now are just not open to folk who can't afford that technology, can't afford those vehicles. So yeah, I'm really super proud to work with Motability Operations and to be involved in the work that they're doing.
Perfect, and I'll get a link to them in the description as well. I'm sure you can send me over some stuff, Claire, that I can put into the description as well. My final one, Claire, we were discussing this kind of, and it's huge, obviously, at Terrapin, and I know with a lot of our events, we like to kind of showcase innovation and showcase startups who maybe can't afford yet to exhibit in our exhibition spaces. But also you do a lot of work with startups, and I know at Solar and Storage London we're going to try and get a few of your startups exhibiting for free. That's one thing that Terrapin like to do. But give us a kind of just to close off, Claire, give us a bit of an insight of the startups you work with and kind of what they're doing in this solar EV renewable energy space as well.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, well, okay, an absolutely shameless plug for me and my LinkedIn, having talked about LinkedIn, but like I do put as much as I can into my LinkedIn so that like it's just a little window into the world of the folks that I work with. So yeah, so head on to my LinkedIn and then you'll see links off to all these different companies from there. So that's, you know, in case I don't speak about anyone or if I don't cover everyone off, but like some of the really interesting ones I think that that's coming to the fleet space. There's a couple in that space. One is called Tual, Tual, looking at adding an additional ruggedized battery to a van, because lots of vans don't go back to a depot at night, they go back to someone's house, and around, you know, something like 40% of the population don't have a driveway, but actually within the van driving community that's actually higher. And so thinking about actually if you could pick up your power pack at the end of the day, and then you could charge overnight, but you're parked on the street or you park wherever you normally park your van, and then you're fully charged in the morning, and then you drop your battery pack off on the way through to wholesalers or wherever you're off to first. Really makes sense for fleets. So they're working with DPD at the moment. They're looking to trial with a number of other fleets. If anyone's listening and thinks, hey, actually, I've got an operational fleet and I've got loads of drivers that would really benefit from that, like feel free to drop me a line. There's also a company called Electric.Green, and they're developing wireless charging. So for vans that go back to depots, those depots are often very tight for space, because why would you pay for a massive yard that you aren't using, right? But electrifying those spaces can be quite hard, particularly with physical hardware. Also, when your vehicles are parked, we talked about vehicle to grid, I'm going to bring it right back to that and say, if you can access that battery at a time when the vehicle isn't needed for that business, then you can start to actually, you know, get the benefit financially from charging and discharging that battery at the time when the grid needs it. So Electric.Green, really exciting. They're about to start doing some wireless bidirectional charging with Royal Mail. So that's really another one that's like really exciting, really starting to get some traction now. And then I guess there's another element to this. We talked about secondhand vehicles, and there's a company definitely to shout out in this space, which is you know, and we talked about what would help mass adoption, secondhand vehicles and confidence in the technology. So a company called Clearwatt are looking at building confidence in the secondhand market through confidence in the battery itself. So they use your mobile phone to get an assessment of the battery. So there's no physical battery device, there's no extra tech, nothing needed. Just test driving your vehicle with your mobile phone to gather data to give you a view on how that battery state of health is looking. And that is going to be so valuable for folks who are selling cars, buying cars, be that private individuals, be that lease companies, be that auction houses. It's like building confidence that this vehicle's battery is in good nick and it's worth what they're asking you to pay for it. So coming up with that like independent, almost like judgment of like, this is a decent battery, a bit like, you know, like the 50-point check that you might see today on an ICE vehicle. So Clearwatt's a really interesting one as well. So that's a little snapshot of some of them in that space. And then there's like a few other companies that are doing some, I guess, stuff that's a bit further out. So there's a company called Catalsys who are looking at off-grid charging of vehicles. So if you could put charging somewhere, but you didn't need a big grid to do it, like how would you do that? They've actually invented a new way of breaking up ammonia into hydrogen, which they put straight into an electrolyzer. And what that does is generate electricity. So basically, it's ammonia to electricity clean air zones. You can put that super off grid somewhere in the middle of nowhere. So that's another interesting one, thinking about, again, different bits of the grid, different bits of this challenge. You're not going to be able to get a cable to literally everywhere you might need it for electric vehicles, but that's okay. We can move energy around in different formats. That's like molecules to electrons. There's really interesting business models around that. So yeah, there's a few interesting ones. And then I guess the most out there one at the minute for me is a new company I'm working with, which is called Yeet, Yeet. So yeah, most people will know that what yeet means in sort of slang is like to chuck it kind of far and hard. And actually, they have invented a drone which will fly higher, further, faster, and last for longer than anybody else. And that's thinking about how do you use battery technology to do the jobs that would previously be really expensive. Maybe you're burning loads of aviation fuel in an aeroplane or a helicopter. Yeah, how do you use technology to inspect all of this solar, right? All of this offshore wind, maybe all of these maritime applications and lots of stuff beyond that. This grid that we're going to build out is going to get bigger. There's all kinds of applications. So there you go. There's a little snapshot of some of the cool stuff that's happening out there.
Definitely, and we look forward to seeing them at Solar and Storage London once we've organised their attendance and things like that.
Yeah, I hope so. That's so exciting.
Definitely. And Claire Miller, that was my final question. Thank you again for giving me your time today. And yeah, see you at Solar and Storage Live in Birmingham.
Awesome. Can't wait. Cheers, Regan.